Welcome to A Pair of Bookends, the book club you can carry anywhere. We are your hosts and hopefully your new bookish pals. I'm Hannah MacDonald.
And I'm Lydia Clare. Welcome to our book club episode for October. We are so excited to share the incredible novel Land of Milk and Honey with you all. A rapturous novel about a young chef whose discovery of pleasure alters her life and inadvertently the world.
C.Pam Zhang is an award-winning writer, born in Beijing and based in the US. Her writing has appeared in Best American Short Stories, The Cut, Esquire, The New Yorker, and The New York Times, to name a few. She's a National Book Foundation 5 Under 35 honoree. Her debut novel, How Much of These Hills Is Gold, was published in 2021 to much acclaim. Longlisted for the 2020 Booker Prize and the Rathbones Folio Prize. It was also a Barack Obama Book of the Year, a finalist for the PEN Hemingway Award, and winner of the Academy of Arts and Letters Rosenthal Award and the Asian Pacific Award for Literature. Her latest novel, Land of Milk and Honey, is out now and is already getting rave reviews across the board, and we are thrilled to have Pam joining us today. So welcome to A Pair of Bookends.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
Thank you for coming on. We're so excited to have you here. And always we ask our first question, which is, what are you currently reading?
So I've just started I'm a Fan by Sheena Patel. It was highly recommended to me by someone at my publishing house. You know, full disclosure, they don't also publish her, so it was a true recommendation. And I also happen to be reading a book of poetry. I've been trying to carry one with me wherever I travel, and right now it's Pilgrim by Kaveh Akbar.
Oh, amazing. I wish I was like one of them people that could carry like poetry with me. I'm not cultured. I shouldn't I?
You read a lot more poetry than I do.
I do. I love a bit of poetry.
Well, to be fair, I only started this habit like 4 months ago because a poet friend of mine told me about it, and I was like, that sounds great. And I do highly recommend it. I tend to take one poem and read it multiple times in different contexts, and it's interesting to see how like my emotional relationship with the poetry changes.
I love such a good idea, and it is something I'm definitely going to try and adopt. I tend to binge poetry. It's really bad, but you know, especially like collections. I think the last one I binged was Rupi Kaur's Homebody, and I was just obsessed. So I binged it in like 3 minutes and then was like, okay, now I need to sit with the poems to actually read them again, because I was just like, this is so good.
So I am just going to jump in straight onto your book, Land of Milk and Honey. Firstly, excellent title. I feel like your titles are my favourite. How Much of These Hills is Gold and Land of Milk and Honey are both excellent titles. And also the cover for this book. Now, our listeners can't see this, but this cover is exquisite, like art. I can't get over it. It's gorgeous.
How many conversations have we had, Hannah, about that cover?
So many. Gorgeous. But how many people have said that to you?
Most people, almost everyone. And I have to give it all to the cover designer, who is named Henry Petrides. He's really, really incredible. He was such a trooper finding like the perfect photo to use, because, you know, with photography, especially of human bodies, there's such a fine line between good and cliche or egregious. We really, really found the correct one.
Oh, completely. It's incredible. I want to start off with your book by talking about your protagonist, who I believe is unnamed, and your protagonist is a chef. And I feel like stories of chefs and their livelihoods and restaurants are sort of really having their kind of cultural moment right now. You know, we've had The Menu, The Bear, Boiling Point. They're all very much on trend right now. And I wanted to ask, why do you think as a society we're so invested in these stories? And what interests you personally about the role of a chef?
I would be very curious to learn when those other references you just listed were first started being created, because I know for me, I've always loved food, but this book came about in the beginning of 2021 when we were still deep in the, I suppose, middle of the pandemic. Mm-hmm. And it was a time when we were cut off from so many of our usual human joys. And food was one of the last connections I sort of had to my own body as a site of pleasure. And food, once I started being able to eat out again, came back to me as a much more holistic experience. I think, there had always been elements of community in sharing a meal, but it really, really hit me after not being able to share a meal out for so long, how much of this dining experience was about creating this moment that exists only for an hour or two, that is magical and dependent on the mood and the presence of whoever happens to be around the table.
Fascinating, honestly, because some of the scenes you need to read this book. So Bookends, if you're listening, come on, you need to get this in your hands. Can you tell us a bit more about the genesis of the novel? So how you came up with it, or was it like you said about like being in the pandemic and things like that? Like, how did it come about?
Yeah, because the pandemic was so bleak, I wrote a book that was in many ways an escape hatch out of it for myself, right? It's a chef, and it's also a chef who happens to live in an even bleaker world than our real one where a fog has come down and killed off food crops and everyone is left with no sunlight and eating this kind of soylent-like gray, gritty meal replacement. And she receives this mysterious offer to go to a mountaintop colony on the border of Italy and France that is helmed by billionaires who are trying to create their own utopia, and food is at the center of it. So I was really leaning into a lot of the pleasures that I could not have, the pleasures of travel, the sort of mystery and wonder of going someplace new, the pleasures of these communal meals. And it was also in many ways my own way to reinforce this idea that we need that kind of joy and excitement in order to survive, right? Like during the pandemic, there was a lot of talk about essentials, right? Essential professions, essential things of our lives. And they happen to sort of circle around having things like food and shelter and health, which are absolutely important, of course, to live like day to day and week by week. But, I have suffered depression. And to me, it was not a rhetorical question to ask, like, what is the point if you have only those essentials, right? Like, what is the point of living decades on this earth? And so I think the pandemic for me was a watershed moment that really made me reckon with the fact that we need pleasure to survive. That is a human necessity because we are not just animals. And, asterisk on that, because I do think animals also want some of those things. But in order to not just be maybe flesh automatons, we need to embrace these things. And so the question then becomes, in seeking our own sources of pleasure, how do we thread that line between something that is purely individualistic and selfish, and also having some kind of engagement with the world and some kind of moral conscience about what our pleasure might mean for others?
Absolutely. And I find it such a fascinating subject because a lot of the time I feel like with either dystopian novels or just with people that are writing novels set during the pandemic, a lot of the issues are kind of social, and, being either isolated on your own or struggling with the people that you're in lockdown with. However, what you focus on is on pleasure. And I think that a lot of the time that's quite overlooked because to me, a lot of my pleasures were taken away. I know, Hannah, you would agree, like, going to the theatre, and a lot of what me and Hannah do ourselves is quite dependent on us being together or being with a lot of people. And I think that what I really loved about this novel was the discovery of pleasure. And how you can bring that to yourself. And it's just, it really is a fascinating subject. Was that something that you really wanted to hone in on?
Yeah, I did. And one reason was that I also think that as difficult as the pandemic was, as difficult as these circumstances can be, moments of great catastrophe also make clearer for us what we need and what we want. And when talking about women's pleasure specifically, I think that so often it is considered a frivolous subject or decadent or just suspect in some way. It's not serious enough, right? Just because it's women's pleasure, which so often is codified as this kind of like eroticized, flimsy, silly thing that is so linked to the male gaze. But I wanted to take it seriously. I wanted to take it rigorously. I really wanted to explore what that meant. I mean, in many ways, my novel, in this terrible isolation, this terrible dystopia that the protagonist is living in, her isolation also gives her this strange opportunity to really sit with herself and kind of ask the question of like, what do I want when nobody is watching? What do I want when some of the external pressures of the world disappear for both good reasons and bad? It's like, oh, it's a terrible tragedy what happens in the world of the novel, and it is this sort of weird opportunity. And I do feel like sometimes, especially when chatting with my best female friends, I realize that they are so often thinking of their lives in service to others that it takes this kind of crisis to reckon with what they want, right? Like I think of all the people, women and other genders as well, who during the pandemic also discovered that, hey, I really love taking care of plants, or hey, I really don't like going out every night, or hey, I love being alone, right? So those were like small glimmers of opportunity in a time of catastrophe as well.
You've made me think of so many different things there about in regards to pleasure and sort of this kind of concept of like who deserves pleasure. You know, we saw that during the pandemic, which you've just made me think of, but then I also see it in our economy in the UK at the moment. You know, people can't afford anything more than paying their bills, and it's mainly upper middle class people that can kind of afford more than just their bills. Everyone else is just expected to live a very basic life. And I think that also leads us into sort of the setting of your novel, which was this kind of strange, secluded environment built for the uber wealthy that's sort of shrouded in secrecy. And I'd love to hear you speak a bit more about what inspired that setting and how you went about creating that.
So part of it was that I used to work in tech in San Francisco. And so I think I still have, you know, people and networks that are still half a foot in that world. And it's a world in which you have these incredibly powerful men sitting at the top who have created this culture of evangelism around their own quite selfish pursuits of perfect utopia, what have you, right? People who are out there and when facing the potential end of the world, instead of thinking like, how can I use my billions to sort of contribute to environmental legislation and, you know, taking us off oil, instead of like, why don't I use my billions to create a secret colony somewhere? So it was taken pretty directly from my fascination with how these people come to be and how they decide to use their wealth and their power in such particular and non-communal ways. And the chef character is somebody who is frankly seduced by that, right? At the start of the book, she is so intently focused on just surviving that she's like, yes, I will sort of like anchor myself to this community of the uber wealthy. I will work this job for them. I will do whatever I need to do to survive. And I think that is a reflection of the fascination that so many of us continue to have with the sort of like tech billionaires, right? That we somehow still find a part of ourselves that is drawn to them, that is drawn to this idea of what they're creating.
Yeah, I think it's such an interesting topic, and I imagine that it was interesting for you to kind of observe those people in tech. Me and Lydia are always speaking about class on the podcast and about, you know, class structure and how that shows up in society and where we sit in our kind of working class backgrounds and sort of what people get that are kind of above us and whether they deserve that, whether they've earned that. And you know, it brings up so many questions for us, and you brought up so many questions for me in your book.
Yeah, I'm also someone who I grew up in a very impoverished background. My family was on food stamps in the US for a good deal of my childhood. And, you know, I've definitely jumped classes, and a lot of that has been through this, you know, I'm not going to deny a lot of it is like hard work and talent on my part. But a lot of that I think is also being anchored to certain institutions that have a different class association, right? In the US, you know, I got to go to an Ivy League university, which just opens you up to a whole network of places. And then, you know, like once you have that affiliation, it allows you to just jump. And so, yeah, I've sort of like seen that for myself.
Yeah, and I mean, not to bang on about it, but, you know, because me and Hannah do. But, you know, for us in the UK in our class system, you know, it is very hard to jump to jump up. I think sometimes it is more difficult for us to jump because despite the fact that both me and Hannah are university educated and at a very good university, it's still our accents, the way that we look, the way that we dress, the way that we act. A lot of that is very hard to, in some ways you have to shrug that off to become, to get to the next stage. And when you're proud of where you come from, which obviously Hannah and I are, it's difficult to then, because you don't want to shrug it off, you want to keep it, right? So it's very interesting to me, the class issue. One of the things that I think defines wealth or class is the way we eat. You know, because a lot of the time Hannah and I mean, Hannah's obsessed with food. She won't mind me saying, we wouldn't go to a very fancy restaurant and eat very fancy ingredients. And a lot of the time, like in the book, when they were kind of wasting, you know, these precious ingredients, that to me was like, no, I was more kind of like our protagonist mum, like, no, you boil it to the within an inch of its life and keep it forever. So it's just such a brilliant way of understanding class and the way that we sit within it, because I do think food is such a huge part of that.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up, because our protagonist also, right, comes from a different class background than the people that she works with. And initially, when she comes onto the mountain and she has this abundance of food that is given, you know, a high monetary value in our world, and especially in this world in which food is such a scant resource, things like foie gras, things like, you know, steak, things like duck breasts, all those kinds of sort of fancy ingredients. It's strange for her because those have such external value. And she sort of slowly comes to realize that those don't satisfy all her cravings. To bring it back to the question of like an appetite and coming to define and recognize the sort of boundaries of one's own appetite and trying to tune the world out, she comes to realize that some of the things she craves are like, you know, probably technically terrible foods that her mom used to make, or she kind of loves some of the like processed foods she grew up on. I think there's a mention in the novel of Doritos, for example, right? And so there's this real push and pull and this real like class and cultural awareness of exactly what you said, what food signifies on the plate.
Absolutely. And I mean, Hannah, if I made you chips, beans, smiley faces, chicken nuggets, all frozen, all processed, you'd be loving it, wouldn't you?
It's a very working class British meal, isn't it?
It's absolutely. But you know, again, it's one of those things where it's like you'd never serve it in a restaurant, but my gosh, every now and again.
Those potatoes are like little hash brown things with like eyes. Yeah,
little smiley faces. Yeah. Honestly, amazing. Change your life. I mean, it tastes like nothing, like cardboard. But honestly, there's something about a working class mum's tea. That's what I call it.
Everything out the freezer.
Like, mum's just she ain't got time. She's just gonna get everything out the freezer. She's gonna chuck it on a baking tray. She's gonna chuck it in the oven for 20 minutes. She's gonna bring it out. She's gonna put it on a plate, and you're gonna eat it. And honestly, a lot of this novel brought that back to me. This nostalgia for good old fashioned working class mum's tea.
I also just want to really quickly recommend an article that you wrote, Pam, for Esquire, and it was about your grandmother's cooking. And I loved it so much because to kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Summarize. There we go. You know exactly. You know my brain. To summarize it, you know, your point of writing that article was to say that, yes, all this good food is great, but what you most crave and what grief taught you is that it's the bad food that's made by people that you love. And I think that's exactly what we've just been speaking about, is that, yes, the food that we grew up on is probably not great for us, but it was made by, you know, our mums, and it was made with love, and it was, you know, that's all the time that they had was to get that out of the freezer and put it in the oven. And I just thought it's such a beautiful article, the way that you used food to explore grief. And I would actually love if I could get you to speak on that.
Yeah, thank you for reading that and for recommending it. Yeah, the article, it has some overlaps and themes with my novel. It's effectively about, this time after my grandmother died. And so my grandmother in Beijing raised me until I was 4 years old. And so by the time I moved away from her, I was still at such a tender age that I don't have any sort of specific memories of ages 0 to 4. So my relationship with her has always been this kind of strange kind where it was very deep and it was almost animalistic in the way I related to her because, I lost my grasp of Mandarin as I got older. And so she didn't know any English. So she and I could never really speak. We could never articulate ourselves in the way I'm accustomed to communicating with people is really spoken through touch and through food. And so after she died, I realized I just had this like incredible hole in myself I was trying to fill with versions of her cooking. And I kept seeking out these very specific Northern Chinese dishes that she would make. And I like the ones I had in restaurants weren't correct. And then I started on my own trying to perfect these recipes. And I think I'm like a pretty decent cook. And I was like referencing like great food, like Chinese food blogs and recipe books. But it felt like the more perfect that got, the farther away it took me from the taste I was missing. And so I realized it was less tied to even a specific food or a specific flavor than just this like intentionality and of what's behind the food, of who is making it for you, and this just feeling of being cared for. Like that is actually, I think, especially in our world, the greatest luxury of all. Just having something made for you, just for you, specifically by someone who loves you, right?
I think that's the thing of like you can make a sandwich for yourself and it's all right. Someone makes one for you and it's amazing. But again, on that line of grief and things, my own experience with the passing of my mother, and Hannah knows this, was that she used to make like terrible pasta. I mean, it wasn't even nice, but like pasta, tomatoes, like, and I remember making it for myself because I felt poorly. I didn't feel great. And it was always like my comfort meal. So I was like, I'm going to make it for myself. And I made it and I took one bite and I cried. And I'd not cried the whole time. I'd been dead stoic. I felt really okay. And then all of a sudden, just the flavour of the food. And it just was so evocative and brought all these memories back of like mum looking after me, mum being like, you're poorly, lie on the couch, I'll make pasta, And it, like still to this day, I cannot make that meal for myself anymore because it's so intrinsically hers. And I remember like calling Hannah like, I'm crying over pasta and I don't know why. And her just be like, yeah, that's normal. But the food has this power.
Thank you for sharing that. That's so incredibly beautiful. And I agree with you. Food has this really transportive power. And I think the power it has is it sort of cuts through our thinking minds, right? And sort of brings you back to sort of an instinct that you have that cannot be denied, right? There are so many, especially, as women moving through the world, as a woman of color, the way the chef in my novel is as a woman of color in the service industry. There are so many concessions you make in life, so many small ways in which you sort of stuff down what you want to conform, to fit in, to make things a little bit easier for everyone around you and thus make things a little bit easier to you. And a lot of us, I think, end up living these lives where we just like have like little lies, perhaps little lies to ourselves littered through our days. But when you eat something, the way it tastes in that first second, that can't be denied. There's like an honesty to that no one can deny.
I know that we've touched a lot on food now and the power of it, but as Lydia's already mentioned, like food and food writing, it brings me so much pleasure. I love it so much. And it's literally the basis of mine and my boyfriend's relationship. We started bonding over our love for food. So it's a very powerful thing. But your novel gave me lots of food for thought. Please forgive the pun.
Can I just applaud the pun? I'm just applauding the pun.
It happened. I'm glad it did.
In thinking about food and desire and sort of hunger and appetite and how these things kind of intersect and how they kind of grow beyond the literal. And I wanted to ask you, what drew you to exploring food and its relation to the mind and the body in this way?
I think that I definitely think of food as an art form. And it's interesting because, like most art forms, it has sort of its like high and low forms, right? And as somebody who, right, like grew up not very wealthy, without much access to most art forms, like food and literature were the only ones that I felt like because of libraries and because, you know, everyone does eat at the end of the day, I felt like those were the only ones that I like fully understand. So in many ways, this was the easiest way for me to grapple with this tension between the human need to just like simply feed ourselves food as like simple physical nourishment, and then art as a kind of higher and not more profound but different kind of nourishment. And food really seemed like the best vehicle to explore that.
Yeah, it absolutely is. And I also loved the way that you explored this through line between hunger and appetite in relation to food, but also in relation to sex. And that also brings up desire in a sense of female desire and female ambition, or how all these things intersect. It's just it's just such a juicy novel. I love it so much.
Juicy. That is the tagline. So one of the things that I found really interesting was the variety of meals he used. And I mean, this is again me being a working class girl, being like, what even is that? Like, I've never even heard of that. At one point we have, and this isn't too much of a spoiler, but we have like mammoths served. But what was your research process like for like, I'm going to cultivate these meals, I'm going to do 7 courses and they're going to look like this? Was it kind of like, I'm just going to be completely spontaneous and improvise it, or were you kind of like, I'm going to research exactly what it should be like?
Yeah, that's a great question. When I write the first draft of any novel, I don't do research going into it because I feel like the first draft really has to be sort of like pure emotion, and I fiddle and refine the details later. So the first draft of the novel, it just came from like a lifetime of eating and observing we've already talked about class and food, but also the racial and cultural hierarchies within the food world. The chef is of Chinese American background, but in order to get this job on this exclusive mountaintop colony, she has to cook high-end French food. And I'm just deeply interested in how ascendant French food and Western fine dining still are in the food world. It's the simple question that came to me. It's like, why is the average American, and I'm guessing the average Brit as well, like okay with the idea of paying like $60-$70 for a chicken dish at a Michelin-starred French restaurant, but most of them would balk at the idea of paying more than like $15 for a chicken dish at a Chinese restaurant, right? It just tells you so much about the intrinsic value associated with each culture, and therefore also with the people who make that food. And so a lot of the sort of elaborate banquet meals that the chef is preparing for her wealthy employers are classic French dishes. And at some point I did do some research. And so there are like classic French dishes that are so absurd that they border on fantastical. There's one in the book that is made at this famous French restaurant in Lyon, which involves like a whole chicken that is cooked within like, I think, a pig's stomach. Like it's in this like inflated pig stomach, and it's in a bath of liquor and truffle, and you cut it open, and it's like, it sounds ridiculous, but that is a real dish. And so like the absurdity that already exists at sort of like the finest fine end of French haute cuisine made it easy for me to then vault into foods like mammoth, right? Which is kind of off, it's offbeat, but I don't think it's that far of a step. And especially when you sort of take that idea of like, well, at some point it isn't about the value people ascribe isn't about the ingredient itself, right? It isn't maybe even about the taste. It's about exclusivity. And so sort of how do you take things to the sort of penultimate form of exclusivity, maybe something like mammoth, when they're able to eat this meat that tastes probably horrible, but is something that literally no one else can eat, and that's what they're paying for. I was just really, really interested in how at the far end of fine dining, we get to this complete divorcing of food from what normal people eat.
Absolutely. I find it really interesting, the whole subject, because for me, even something that is, it's commonly served at the moment, which is, it's like a whole bird, and it's kind of sort of deep fried or whatever, and it's, you just eat it whole. That to me is like, oh my gosh, it's not that hard for me then to think, if we had the capacity, that we could eat kind of woolly mammoth or saber-toothed tiger, or something that we've got the DNA of. And then honestly, it was like, it's bonkers, but it makes sense, because we do, it's like, in a way, we divorce that kind of feeling of like, I find this food pleasurable. We divorce that feeling so that we can have something that's absolutely, but no one else has ever had this in the world, So I'll eat this vile piece of meat because it's exclusive and only I can have it.
I think a lot of it, like you said, Lydia, it is based on wealth, and they aren't interested in necessarily how the food will taste. It's the fact that they can afford to taste that. They want to splash out their wealth on this. Like you said, it's an exclusive dish. It's almost repulsive to read about those characters in the book, that they aren't interested in eating a meal because it's a communal thing and it's joyful and it's pleasurable. They just want to be at a seat at this table and to be able to say that they've had this exclusive meal. Yeah, I just think there was something really like grotesque in that.
I feel like I should have said at the start as well, to all our Bookends listening, if you are reading this, you will need copious amounts of either like tortilla chips, nuts, you need something on the side, because honestly, it made me hungry the whole time. I was like, I couldn't stop eating.
Yeah, I think tortilla chips are a great rec. Anything like crunchy or chewy, I think, is a good snack to have on hand.
100%. Honestly, I'm just saying it should be written on the cover. Bring snacks.
I really want to ask, because I've been really curious about it. In your novel, we obviously know that it says on the blurb that the smog is starting to spread and crops are being affected. So what I mean when I say it's on the blurb is that I'm not spoiling anything by telling people that. And I've obviously, with me and Lydia, we're both actors and we've worked in theatre, and I find there's a huge push in theatre, but also with a lot of my writer friends, that there's a lot of push now for artists to write more about climate change and sort of explore that. And I was curious about whether it was a conscious choice for you to kind of tackle that topic. Could you talk a bit more about how you approached it in terms of the smog that you write about in your book and how it impacts the environment and the crops?
Yeah, the smog in the book was pretty directly inspired by the wildfire smoke that has been a presence in California, in the West Coast of the United States, for at least the past, I want to say, like 7 or 8 years now. So I know that more recently, I know there were fires in Europe this summer, right? And there was wildfire smoke in New York too this past summer. So it's become more present to a larger part of the population. But that feeling of heaviness that descends when the sun is blocked out. And literally leaving your house is a danger. You can like feel it in your lungs. You feel trapped inside. That is something that is so fundamentally devastating that I have a hard time putting it into words. I think that by this point, intellectually, we all understand the things we might lose due to climate change, flora and fauna and all that. But the emotional impact of not having the sun, which is something we all take for granted, it's huge. And so the smog in the book comes from that. And it also comes from the fact that it just feels it's so literal, and it feels so metaphorically on point, right? That the world just turns gray, that your mood just turns gray, that everything feels dreary and heavy, and sort of your entire life is like bracketed by this feeling of like gloom and loss. Oh, that sounded really intense.
Love it. I'm here for it.
At all.
Yeah,
it is intense. So you're not hiding anything. It's something that we all need to speak about, and we all need to be mindful of. And people have spent so long avoiding it that, you know, look at the mess we're kind of in. You know, it's now something that you can't possibly avoid because it's happening and it's real.
Yeah. And at the same time that I wanted to convey the like immensity of that kind of horror, you know, again, the book is not a bleak book.
No.
The book, like I said, was a bit of an escape hatch. It was an opportunity for me to explore, as I was referencing before, how even in these times of grief and catastrophe, how can we get something out of them? How can we move forward through them? And so in terms of the climate aspects of the book, I was really interested in how I do think there is like this modern tendency, because there is so much bad news all the time, to just fall into this attitude of despair and of assumed pessimism that because things are bad and more bad things will happen tomorrow, that things will only ever be bad. I think that stance, oftentimes unintentional, of cynicism is really problematic and really unhelpful, right? I think that cynicism is frankly an immature mindset. I think I used to be more invested in that as a younger person, when I could be like, you know, I know better than everyone else. Everything's screwed up, right? But I wanted to explore how this kind of cynicism and this real fear of what we lose might actually get in the way of us finding opportunities and sort of accepting some of the things that have happened and being like, oh, okay, this is how things are. Where do we go from here, right? Like if we spend all our news articles, all of our time thinking about everything that's gone extinct, everything that's no longer being the same, that doesn't leave us space to be like, okay, and then what do we do from here? Again, I'm not saying that obviously, like I'm a huge believer in climate legislation and climate activism, but there needs to be that belief that there are things still possible that we perhaps haven't thought of yet, right? And I take a lot of that optimism, frankly, less from like humans than from the endurance of the planet itself. And what I mean by that is the most heartening fact I hold deep within myself is that even if we humans really mess it up and sort of like kill ourselves, the planet's going to actually be just fine. It will survive. It will thrive. It will find a new way to be, right? There's a kind of immense intelligence and durability that is beyond human understanding. You know, for example, what happened in Chernobyl, right? After we bombed the living daylight out of that place and humans left the area, the plant life came back, the animal life came back. A similar thing happened in Yellowstone, which is a national park in the United States, where first we killed off all the wolves, and then scientists decided to reintroduce wolves into the population. And even, again, these scientists, experts in their fields, had no idea of the ripple effect that bringing wolves back, because, you know, wolves affected, I think, the local like caribou or reindeer or deer population, and that affected the sort of growth of trees, which affected beavers, which affected water flow. And so like literally there were streams that had been dry for as long as people could live back, right? There's this sort of awesome, wondrous durability about the planet. And I think holding room for the capacity of the world to continue to surprise us, and for us too to continue to surprise ourselves, is really important.
And I think your optimistic mindset towards that subject is definitely reflected in the novel. And I don't think it's much of a spoiler for me to say that the way you tell this story is the protagonist is telling us from a future perspective. So she's looking back on everything that occurred in this mountaintop sort of colony, and you know, she's relaying that story. So we know that there's a future, and we know that there's possibility to endure everything that's happening. So the optimism definitely comes through, and I think that's a great way to look at it, is that we actually have so much at our disposal to change, you know, the potential outcome of the planet if we, you know, if we care and if we're willing to make that positive change. So I really loved the way you explored that theme.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that framing device of the book being told by the narrator from the future at a much older point was really important to me. I found during the pandemic that some of the only books I was able to read for a while were biographies of women writers and women artists. And it was because I really needed proof, frankly, that women could live through these periods of immense heartbreak and grief, like war, devastation, and still come out on the other side and sort of make great and endearing art out of it, that out of a period of disaster and catastrophe, there could be something fertile in it too.
Absolutely. And it's such a wonderful book. I cannot recommend this book enough to people, because it is truly a book that will stay with you long after you finish the last page. And thank you so much for talking to us today, because we so appreciate your time and your thoughts, because it's a truly incredible book and we can't stop banging on about it. We would just like to end our interview with you, unfortunately, but with some recommendations. So have you got any amazing things you've watched recently, read, listened to?
Yeah. Also, just thank you for sharing your space and your stories and your backgrounds here too. It's been really lovely. So something I've been taking in recently, I watched Women Talking, the film, which is based on a novel of the same name by Miriam Tays, and I usually can't stand. Not that I can't stand. I can't handle watching movie to film adaptations, because if I love the original text, I get like goosebumps all over my body whenever something like feels a bit different than I imagined it. But this is a true incredible adaptation. Yeah, it's a wonderful movie. And what else? I've also been recently read a book called Mobility by Lydia Kiesling, and it sort of presents a different take on our future. It's about a young woman who grows up kind of and ends up working in the oil industry, and it's really brilliant and really smart, and sort of takes place from like I think the 1980s and into maybe 10 or 20 years in the future. It's really ambitious and sprawling and wonderful. And my last thing is I have to recommend this restaurant in London that I love so much. It's called Smoking Goat in Shoreditch. And it is Thai influenced, or just Thai restaurant that works on a wood fire grill, and everything there is absolutely delicious.
I have to visit there on my next trip to London.
Oh, here we go. Have we got to go Shoreditch?
Yes.
Yes, we do. One recommendation that I have is the series Ahsoka, which is a Star Wars series, but it has the most incredible performance by a man called Ray Stevenson. Unfortunately, he's passed away just after filming it, and it's his last ever recorded performance, and it is tremendous. Like, you don't have to have watched Star Wars, you don't have to have any contact, just chuck it on and watch him just absolutely light up the screen, because he's incredible. And I feel like people need to see this performance to truly understand what we've lost, because he's incredible.
Amazing. Pam, thank you so much for joining us today. And for our listeners, Land of Milk and Honey is out now, and I will pop a link in the show notes for you to buy yourselves a copy if you haven't got one already. And is there anywhere our listeners can find you on social media?
Yeah, it's just my full author name, C.Pam Zhang, and I'm on Instagram.
Amazing. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you so much, listeners, for listening. That is all we've got time for, so bye!